You're listening to The Spin-Off, a brand new podcast looking at the political and election scene across the USA. I'm your host, Hugh Evans. In this episode, what's happening to red state Democratic senators in the age of Trump? I'm talking about Democratic senators in Republican states, the position they hold in a Republican-dominated Washington, and what this all means heading into November's elections. The music you're hearing is called Augustus Rises, composed by Jeff Briggs and Roland J. Rizzo, taken from the soundtrack to Sid Meier's Civilization 2. As we approach the midterm elections in November, a lot of discussion has highlighted the wave of Democratic senators up for re-election who represent states which backed Donald Trump in 2016. Formerly blue and purple states which have turned increasingly red, including Ohio, Missouri, Montana and West Virginia, are still represented by Democrats in the US Senate. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm considering 6 red state Democrats who are up for re-election in November. They are Joe Donnelly in Indiana, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, John Tester in Montana, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, and Joe Manchin in West Virginia. We can't tell at this point how the politics of Donald Trump and the changes in both parties as well as the individual states will affect the senators' re-election chances. But today I'm going to be considering the position of these red state Democrats in the age of Trump and how they can continue to represent increasingly Republican states and what this all means for American politics in general. It's worth mentioning that while there are other Democratic senators who are also facing re-election in other states which Trump won in 2016, including Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania and Florida, Republican strength in these states is not as pronounced as in the states I've previously mentioned, but ultimately what you consider to be a red, blue or purple state is largely down to your own personal interpretation. We can see the party divide between these red state Democratic senators and the rest of the Senate Democratic Party on key votes in the Senate, including the nomination of Mike Pompeo as Rex Tillerson's replacement as Secretary of State, which was supported by McCaskill, Donnelly, Heitkamp and Manchin, as well as 2 amendments introduced to the Senate in February 2018 by Republicans Pat Toomey and Chuck Grassley. These amendments focused on conditions for funding for so-called sanctuary cities, as well as citizenship for DACA recipients and funding for Trump's border wall. With these amendments, Senators Donnelly and Manchin supported both, and McCaskill and Heitkamp each supported one of them, even though both amendments ultimately failed in the Senate. The rest of the Senate Democratic Party, particularly those senators from blue states, have largely maintained a party line across the board. The nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the US Supreme Court in April 2017, just over 2 months after his nomination by Donald Trump, passed the Senate with 54 votes to 49. With this vote, we see a similar picture. The Senate Republicans were backed by Democratic Senators Heitkamp, Manchin and Donnelly, with 1 Republican senator not voting. Every other Democratic senator and Democratic caucusing independent voted against Gorsuch's nomination. Where Democratic senators vote with Republicans, we usually see the same names cropping up, mostly from this group of red state Democrats. Which of course brings us on to the current Supreme Court nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. Whilst Kavanaugh's been meeting with senators on Capitol Hill, so far no Democratic senator has yet sat down with him. Joe Manchin is set to be the first Democrat in the Senate to meet Kavanaugh and will sit down with him at the end of the month, whilst Heidi Heitkamp has also said she will meet with Kavanaugh. For many Senate Democrats, support for Kavanaugh may still be difficult to come by. In one of my previous blog posts, I commented about how issues such as Roe v. Wade could cause problems for Democratic senators when voting on any Conservative Supreme Court nominee. However, concern lately has been directed at Kavanaugh's views on the role of the independent counsel. Kavanaugh suggested in 2016 that he would want to put the final nail in the Supreme Court precedent from 1988, which upheld the existence of the independent counsel. For many, this creates uncertainty as to how Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh might view the constitutionality of Robert Mueller's current investigations. Kavanaugh also may or may not believe that sitting presidents cannot be indicted on criminal charges, although what exactly we mean by this is down largely to legal discussion and interpretation. For example, legal scholars might suggest that a president must be impeached and removed from office before any criminal charges can then be brought against them. In any case, this provides uncertain news to those Democrats who still see the impeachment of President Trump as a distinct possibility. Democrats are also keen, it is being reported, to see documents from Kavanaugh's time working in the George W. Bush White House, and from his time working for the prosecution team in the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton, in order to determine whether they think he is a suitable nominee. It seems to be the case that virtually all Republican senators will be supporting Kavanaugh's nomination, including, in all probability, Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, while most of the red state Democratic senators I've mentioned, as well as Alabama Senator Doug Jones, are yet to offer an intention one way or another, other than the suggestion that they will review the nomination. However, Joe Manchin has insisted that he will not be told by Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer how to vote on Kavanaugh's appointment, saying Schumer could kiss his you-know-what if he tried to whip Manchin into voting against Kavanaugh. Heidi Heitkamp, meanwhile, said in a statement that she will not be taking a partisan stance, and instead would contribute to an exhaustive and fair process, such as she offered for Neil Gorsuch, whom she eventually supported, and that this is the kind of leadership North Dakotans expect from their senators, she said in a statement released on Twitter. Of course, none of this is to say that senators such as Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Manchin will base their decisions on their hopes and prospects for re-election. It's worth noting at this point that, as of July 2018, Inside Elections has rated North Dakota's Senate race as tilt Republican, whilst Sabato's Crystal Ball, CNN and the Cook Political Report maintain it as a toss-up. But I'll examine North Dakota's Senate race in detail at another time. All this illustrates is just that Senate elections are still looming in the back of everyone's minds when it comes to Kavanaugh's nomination. What it will mean, however, is that in the age of Trump, there may be more pressure on red state Democrats to be beholden to their state and not to their party than would be on other senators from perhaps more reliably Democrat states. If the senators' voter bases are perhaps more conservative than the average Democrat office holder, then the senator would seek to reflect this by occasionally getting on board with the Republicans' plans. Now, this may seem like I'm stating the obvious. However, this all plays into a bigger picture of political change and partisan divides in the United States. Indeed, following the 2016 presidential election, along with the changes in what both parties stand for, red state Democrats currently form a squeezed and decreasing group. For all our discussion on red state Democrats, conversely, there are no real blue state Republicans in the Senate to speak of. The closest we possibly get to a blue state Republican could be Susan Collins in Maine, but Maine was hardly a solidly blue state in 2016. Hillary Clinton only won statewide by around 3 points, while Donald Trump carried the state's 2nd congressional district by a full 10 points. Otherwise, Mark Kirk in Illinois and Scott Brown in Massachusetts were previous blue state Republicans, although both failed in their attempts for re-election, as did Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire. As it stands today, the United States Senate is increasingly partisan. 30 years ago, during the 1987 to 1989 Congress, 22 states were represented by a split Senate delegation, that is to say, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat. At the start of the current sitting Congress, that number was 12, including Maine, served by independent Senator Angus King, who caucuses with the Democrats, and of course Susan Collins, but not including Vermont, as it is home to Senator Bernie Sanders, who caucuses with the Democrats, and long-standing Democrat Patrick Leahy. It's not really a split Senate delegation when you think about it. Even then, many of these states are competitive at the presidential level, with 8 of them having given electoral college votes to at least 2 presidents out of Donald Trump, Barack Obama and George W. Bush at one time or another, with a further 3 giving votes to Bill Clinton at some point, as well as at least one of the other 3 presidents. We only need to look at a map of the US Senate makeup to see the correlation between split delegation states and traditional swing states. It could well be the case that in November that number drops yet again. The important point here is that this is not necessarily due to the ascent of Donald Trump and his victory in long-time Democratic states such as Michigan and Wisconsin, but rather it's due to the rebranding of American politics in recent years even before Trump really came on the scene. Many see the Republicans as becoming even more socially conservative, especially on issues such as abortion, at the expense of their traditional small government, Main Street economic standpoint. Meanwhile, the Democrats are seen as representing increasingly left-leaning college campuses and upwardly mobile white-collar liberals over their traditional blue-collar support base in northern states and elsewhere. So the unenviable position of this group of red state Democrats is simply a byproduct of this change. So what's the solution to this? Well, the short answer is I don't know. As long as the 2 parties drift further apart, then partisanship will only increase both in the House and Senate and around the country, with candidates representing the direction the parties are heading running for office across the US. Even though there's nothing to suggest at this time that Bernie Sanders-style Democratic Socialists or hard pro-life Trump Republicans are the real future for their respective parties. Meanwhile, the whole centre ground is having to choose one way or another between increasingly flanderised parties. It ultimately remains to be seen exactly what happens following November's midterms. But for the red state Democrats who are up for re-election in November, their position is a very unhappy medium. I hope you've enjoyed this pilot episode of the spin-off, and as I continue to develop the podcast, I hope you will join me for future episodes. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, follow me on Twitter at HughCHEvans, or check out my blog at hughchevans.wordpress.com. I'm Hugh Evans, thank you for joining me.